Hi, everyone, and thanks to the BNA for the invitation here. I'm aware that I am last in the long day of Zoom stuff here, so I'm going to make this pretty easy, I think, and hopefully pretty brief. Yeah, we're going to talk about boosting credibility. Now, I think one of the things to flag up is this amazing effort that the BNA are doing towards credibility in neuroscience. You can go along to the BNA credibility website where they've got loads of information and resources there, all geared towards neuroscience being as credible as it possibly can be. And I'm just, beyond honored to have been the winner of this year's BNA Credibility Prize for individual researchers. And it kind of comes as a bit of a surprise to me, because I think you'll see later on in the talk what we do as a lab really feels like a team effort, but nevertheless, they decided to give me the individual prize. So I'm going to thank loads of people later on that I wouldn't have been able to do any of this without. But yeah, these credibility prizes are just part of what the BNA is doing to try and boost reliability and reproducibility and other things that go along to make neuroscience as credible as it possibly can be. Yeah, so today, I know there are plenty of people out there who are way more proactive. They are stronger advocates for credibility than I ever have been. And I think maybe they would have been, I could name, a lot of people who might have been more deserving winners of the prize. But anyway, what we try and do as a lab is to just try and kind of act on principles that we have that we think are important for making our science as credible as possible. And the really key thing here for us is for things to be open, right? So we have an open science policy in the lab, and there's a few things that we do to try and make that happen. And I'm just going to tell you about that today. So I don't want any of this to feel necessarily prescriptive or like this is what you guys have to do. I'm just saying this is what we do. This is how we make it work for us and why we think it's a good idea. Yeah, so we make sure everything we do is open access. That's the first thing in terms of publications. We work really hard to make sure that everything we do is open access at the point of publication, so everyone can read what we do. And kind of feeding into that is the fact that we do preprints. We preprint everything that we end up putting out as a primary research article has been a preprint before that. And I think these two things, they're just becoming more and more standard, essentially. I mean, everybody's doing this these days, and I don't think there's a great deal of argument to say that these are things you shouldn't be doing. But if anyone wants to discuss these things later, then I'm always happy to talk about this. I'm going to talk a bit more today about the third thing that we do towards open science in the lab, which I think is maybe something that isn't quite so commonplace. And that's sharing all of our raw data. And that's what we do. So whenever we publish a primary research article, we put literally all of the data, all of the images, the recordings, the analyses, the scripts, plus all of the stats and those kind of things. We make those publicly available so that anybody can download and do whatever they want with them, essentially. And you might ask, well, why do we do that? There are potential pros and cons for sharing data. One of the pros, I think, actually, it's an unexpected gain, I think, from doing this kind of approach, is that you actually get to secure your data and make it really accessible for the very long-term future. And that applies to us as a lab as well. So unless you are very, very good at archiving your past data, which many of you may well be, but I have to say, hold my hand up, I am not. I love the fact that the data that we use to produce particular papers and the work that we did is now there and in an accessible place online that I can go to and find really, really quickly without having to rummage through hard drives or folders or anything else. And literally last week, someone in my lab downloaded some of our freely accessible data so that they could have a look at something, and it was by far the easiest way for them to do that. So that's one reason. Another reason which can happen is that you can end up getting extra credit for your work. When you publish the data sets that you've been working with, then they have a DOI, digital object identifier, alongside them. They can be cited separately from the actual study that went along with them, and you can end up getting extra credit that way, more likely you would end up getting credit from the fact that if people obviously use the data associated with the publication, they should be citing the publication that it came from. So it all goes towards kind of building the kind of credit for the work that you did. I have to say that's not the primary reason why we do these things. Really, for me, the thing that I really hope to get out of this data sharing is that literally you get extra science from it. And I mean that not like we get extra science, but as in the community gets extra science from it. That's the whole point, really. You hope that somebody's going to come along with some great ideas and some great tools for analyzing things and take some of the data that we've produced and do something really interesting and cool and new with them that we never would have even thought that we would do. And yeah, that's the hope that you get out of that. And I think, you know, especially I have to say, not necessarily with our data, but certainly with other people's data I've seen, potentially, I guess, in the transcriptomics field, this is happening all the time at the moment. I think it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And the other thing is that it just feels like the right thing to do. I have to say, I feel like these are not necessarily our data that we own in any meaningful sense. We've been kind of commissioned to do this work by various funding bodies. And I think, you know, we should be putting it out there and we should be allowing the data to do as much as they possibly can do. And I think there's probably an ethical component to it as well. I mean, there was the brilliant talk from Charlotte earlier about the climate crisis and, you know, the fact that potentially, okay, data storage also has its costs, probably nowhere near as much as the costs of actually doing the research in the first place, I would think, for our kind of wet lab science that we do. So I would hope that we would be, you know, helping a little bit in terms of carbon usage by getting people to reuse data that we've already got. There's the animal side of things as well. Like if animals have been killed in the service of the research, then you would hope that that research can spread as far and as wide as it possibly can. All right, so what are some of the potential downsides that you might want to consider? I think the first one that comes to most people's mind is like, these are my data, no one else can have them. And I don't know, I just kind of got over that. I think from a practical point of view, the idea that once you've published the main thing that you really wanted to do with those data, the idea that someone else would come along and then do exactly the other experiments that you might have in your head that you might one day do with those data and then publish them before you, even though you know those data inside out and you've been working on them probably for years, seems kind of small to me. And certainly nothing like this has ever happened to us so far. I mean who knows? Yeah, I just think that, you know, and if somebody comes along and uses our data to do something really interesting, well, that's just a bonus. That's not scooping. That's something we probably would never have done anyway, wouldn't have occurred to us to do. So I've kind of discounted that. There may be fields in which this is a real problem, in which case you really need to take it into account. Okay. The other thing is that people worry that, you know, what if people show that what we did was wrong? Or what if they have an alternative interpretation of what we found? And I have to say that is entirely possible. You are opening yourself up for additional scrutiny. I have to say, I think that's a good thing. And I'm going to rule that one out as well, because I think that's science. That's how it should work. I think it's absolutely the way that we should be able to learn and move on as a field. So I think the big one for me, the one that actually is detrimental, is that it takes time and effort and money sometimes, certainly in terms of funding the time and the effort, to get the data ready to share it. And I think that's the one that you really need to take into consideration. Where can you share stuff? Well, I'm just going to list some of the places that we've shared our data. There's lots of places you can do it. This is, I think, is one of the issues with data sharing. There's not like one big place like bioRxiv is for preprints where you can just, everybody sticks their data. It's different for different kinds of data, and there are lots of repositories out there. I think there are some places where if you've done certain types of experiments, then you are absolutely expected to put the data in those repositories, and certainly anything omics-wise, transcription-wise, you would be expected to stick that in the NCBI gene expression omnibus, and brilliantly, everyone in that field seems to do that. It's one of the, you know, the big places where data sharing is just the norm, and I think that's great. One of my favorite places, I love neuromorpho.org. They've been doing this for years and years and years, absolutely blazing a trail for data sharing. The thing I love about Neuromorpho is it's dead easy to use. They do a wonderful active job of curating everything on there, but the main thing is they are proactive. So if you've ever published anything in terms of neuronal morphology, like a morphological reconstruction of a neuron, they actually email you and they say, we've seen your reconstructions in your paper. Can we have the data, please? And I thought they used to anyway. I thought they used to have a list of all the people they'd emailed and then all the people who'd actually given them the data. And you can kind of do the math to figure out who hasn't shared their data. But I just looked on their website and I don't think that's there anymore. But anyway, they are at least very proactive in going after the data. And I really, really like that. Other places you can share your data, I've just put these up because these are places where we've put data before, big repositories like Figshare and like Dryad. And actually, one big option you can often have is that your institution might have a repository often run through your IT service or through your your library service, which is what happens at King's College London. We actually have an agreement with Figshare, and we can put data there essentially for free, which is absolutely brilliant, because if you go independently to these websites, then you end up having to pay a certain amount for a certain amount of data for a certain amount of time. This is what it looks like. So you get something like this. If you share your data, you have a DOI so everyone can go and see it. You have a link to the paper that the data came from, which is great. Then the paper also will have a link coming to the data, and that can be established in lots of different ways. And you get to see whether people have looked at it and downloaded it and done all kinds of other things with it. All right, just finally, some kind of tips about how you can make data sharing a little bit easier. I think the number one thing is this is teamwork. It takes a lot of time and effort to get data sorted and in the right place, and definitely adding up to the right version of the right thing that you did for that analysis, and finding it all, sometimes after years. And I have to say, I don't micromanage my lab to the extent that I know exactly what's in what folder from what person. So this utterly relies on the team of people around you and the fact that they're willing to, go back and find all the data and put it all together. And we'll talk a little bit in a minute about what makes that a little bit easier. So I want to thank all of these people who've worked really hard on sharing the data that we've produced as a lab over the last few years. Sometimes even, long after they've left the lab, and we're still going with trying to get things out. So, it's a real effort from lots of people. And then I think, it takes some planning. And I think coming on to that previous point, it's very good to set expectations as early as possible. So when people join the lab now, I tell them we're an open science lab. We share all of the data that we publish. So, you need to know that when you publish papers with us, we're going to be preparing the data as well to stick those out. And if people have that in their brains, then they've hopefully got a better idea about what they need to do to make that a reality. Also with collaborators, is a really good idea straight from the get-go. If we're involved in this, we're going to publish stuff, then we want to put the data out there, and I hope you're okay with that. And that's a really important conversation to have very early on in that kind of interaction, I think. You need to decide exactly what you're going to share. Some people very happy just putting the data, like the numerical data that they've got from sort of summary graphs and those kind of things. That's absolutely fine. That's wonderful. That's a lot better than nothing. But on the other hand, some people decide to share, like we do, all of the raw data, all of the raw files, all of the images, and the recordings and those kind of things as well. So you need to decide at what level you want to share your data. And the final thing is to work on the timing of things. So, ideally, you get this out at the time of publication, maybe even beforehand if you want reviewers to be able to address the data. And I have to say, we've never managed to do that. Sometimes these things take a long time. That's okay. The data can come along later, and it's definitely better publishing at some point rather than never at all. But thanks for listening, and I'm very, very happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Matthew. There are a few anonymous questions that have come through. The first of which is, how do you feel about pre-registration? I know this is a point that you raised, as well as Fiona Ramage also raised this earlier. How is it? What do you feel about it in terms of preclinical studies in animal models? If you plan the study carefully and are honest about it, surely pre-registration is unnecessary.
Pre-registration is a whole other game, I have to say, and it's not something we've done. And I think the reason why we haven't gone down that route is because I always feel like the potential, the possibility for us to actually, you kind of, in our field anyway, it's very rare that you have a whole, paper's worth of experiments that you could ever can't say it's going to work like this, and we're going to do it like this. And so I don't think we're ever at the point where we can pre-plan to that extent. So I have to say, I don't have any expertise or knowledge on pre-registration whatsoever, but I think, where that level of planning is possible, and like, for example, where you've got data sets that are already there and you're going to do particular analyses on them, I think they're a great idea because they make sure that you publish the negative stuff as well as the positive stuff.
Fantastic. I must admit, I've not done it either, but I do like it as a concept.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
nice. Yeah. Another question is in terms of data sharing for human-based studies, how would you do this with the current GDPR regulations? How would you modify a consent form to inform participants of the sharing, especially if you're unsure of exactly where you're going to be sharing it?
Yeah, obviously a really important question, and I'm going to apologize again. I'm sorry, we don't do any human work, so I've literally zero expertise in that as well. So I think you can certainly plan ahead to know where you're going to be sharing. That's something you just completely determine. That's not a problem. But as you would, there must be ways that you can do things so that you can make sure that you know exactly how you're going to meet those kind of criteria. Yeah, but then there've got to be other places to do that. Yeah.
So I think if Rick would like to chime in there, I think he's just mentioned that he might have some insight there. I don't know if Rick can come on. There you go.
Sure, thanks. I'm not an expert in GDPR, although I've tried to read as much as I can. So we changed our consent forms for our human imaging studies a few years ago, where we make it very clear to volunteers that their data could be potentially used by anyone in the world for any purpose. And even that some of the data we share could potentially be used to identify them. And as long as you make that very clear, and as long as the information they're informed about this, we haven't had any one of our volunteers yet object to that, to signing a form saying they agree to that sharing. So there's nothing special about GDPR. If you have consent for the participant to share data with anyone openly, then that's fine. There's no, as far as I'm aware, legal issue about this. There are issues about whether they can retract that permission later on, for which there's a research exemption in the GDPR. But for initial data sharing, as long as you make it clear that people understand the data that's being shared, the risks of it, etc., and they agree to it, as far as I'm aware, it's fine.
Fantastic. That's a apt and very concise answer. Thank you, Rick. Matthew, we're just a minute or so over time, so I might just ask the final question. There are other questions that I believe will be put into the Padlet for you to address,
sure.
but I'm just wondering, in a more broad sense, lots of different institutions, the BNA, for instance, the UKRI, the MRC, with their Plan S, etc., have done a lot in order to try and promote data sharing and open science. But my question to you is have we all as a community done enough? And if not, what else is there to be done to push this forward?
Yeah, I don't know. I think we're getting there. I really do. And I think things are really improving in terms of the openness. And I think, like I said at the start, things like preprinting and certainly open access publications is just becoming the norm. And in some ways, you're being forced to do it by funders' remits and other things. Yeah, I think from a data sharing point of view, I think it's going to take a little bit longer. It's hard, isn't it? Because I'm convinced myself, and I'm very happy to do it, but I'm not sure in what way you go about convincing people who don't want to do it. And I can see that there might be reasons why that's the case. I mean, whether the funders need to get it, like they have done on open access publishing, and just say, look, you need to share your data. Otherwise, we're going to put in the same kind of restrictions that we do when you don't make your publications open access. That's a possibility. I think that, that kind of stick approach might work well. How could you I'd always much rather use a carrot kind of, this is a good thing for everyone to do. And, maybe just, discussing it more, being more open about it. One of the things I try and do is put out the fact that, yeah, we share our data. So whenever I put a list of publications or something, I make it really clear, like, this is the publication and this is the data set, so people can see that we're doing that.
Sure.
And I think maybe those things, when you're giving talks, maybe, you know, as well as the little reference for this is the publication that these data came from, you maybe reference, maybe I should do that. Put in, you know, where the data are, something like that, make it more normal.